Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Keeping Your Kids on God's Side by Natasha Crain from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will be looking at chapters 31 through 35 of the book. So let's get started with chapter 31. Does the Bible support rape? Getting into the nice happy topics at this point in the book, aren't we? Well, Crain begins by reminding us of the previous chapter where she was forced to kinda, sorta admit that the Bible condones slavery. Though remember, it's not as bad as all that because it's not God's ideal. You may have heard that the Bible condones slavery. Okay, yeah, kinda, it does, yeah. But it's not God's ideal. So don't let any old skeptic tell you otherwise. And then she says that despite what you may have heard from some skeptics, it's absolutely untrue that the Bible depicts God as approving of rape. Well, that is a bold statement, especially considering she just acknowledged the existence of biblically condoned slavery, sex slavery to be specific, in the previous chapter. Now, she didn't call it that. In fact, she specifically said that's not what it was, but that's what it was. Girls being sold as servants to men who intend to marry them eventually. And it's difficult to imagine how that practice could exist in the absence of condoned rape. Well, first, Crain examines the Bible verses that lay out some laws related to rape. She begins with Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 23 and 24, which declare that if a man has sex with a betrothed virgin, they should both be taken out of the city and stoned to death. Why isn't this a problem for Crain? Well, quote, the situation described here is between two consenting adults, a man and an engaged woman. The passage doesn't say anything about rape. It assumes that if the encounter happened where people were nearby in the city, the woman would cry out for help. If she didn't, it assumes that means she consented. The penalty for this consensual sex between a married man and an engaged woman was death, just as it was for adultery between two married adults, Leviticus 20:10. Well, she's already defended slavery in the previous chapter, so I suppose I shouldn't be surprised by this. A few points. First, just because the passage doesn't specify that the act being regulated is potentially rape doesn't mean that it's definitely consensual, as is the case throughout the Bible. The question of whether the woman consented is not even addressed, and that's because it wasn't relevant to the authors of the Bible. Women were treated as property. They were bought and sold, and when they were harmed, that harm was punished not because they deserved justice, but because their husbands or their fathers did. The passage from Deuteronomy to which Crain is referring says that the man who has sex with the betrothed virgin should be punished because, quote, he violated his neighbor's wife. Not because he violated her. She has no significance apart from the man to whom she belonged. And you can't have sex between two consenting adults when the most basic human rights of one of those adults to say no is not recognized. Also, note this bit of the passage emphasized by Crain as if it helps her case that this isn't about rape. The Bible reads, you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman, because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city. Crain says that this is important because the law assumes that the woman was not crying out for help because she consented. That's what that means. If you don't understand what rape is, you have no standing to declare that a given passage of the Bible isn't talking about rape. She didn't call for help is not evidence that a rape did not occur. It might be evidence that the victim was too frightened to call for help. It might be evidence that the victim was unable to call for help. The fact that Natasha Crain apparently accepts this argument as evidence that the woman sentenced to death by this law was not a rape victim is evidence, however, that in addition to being a Christian apologist, Crain is a rape apologist. And she's also completely fine with two consenting adults being stoned to death for having sex with each other. Adultery is a divinely mandated death penalty offense, and she's completely fine with that. and will still argue that the God of the Bible is our transcendent moral standard. Crain turns to the next three verses, those being Deuteronomy 22, verses 25 through 27, which specify that if a man seizes a betrothed woman and has sex with her, he shall be put to death, but she will not be considered to have committed an offense because, quote, though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. Crain calls this passage the clearest condemnation of rape in the Bible, and that's probably true, and that's also pathetic. Once again, it's the responsibility of the woman, the person being raped, to cry for help. Otherwise, the law will assume that the sex was consensual. Does the Bible have anything to say about women who aren't betrothed being sexually assaulted? Sure it does. Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29, which say that a man who seizes and lies with a woman who isn't betrothed will be required to pay her father 50 shekels of silver, and will also be forced to marry her, and will be unable to divorce her for as long as he lives. Crain acknowledges that, sure, it sounds bad to legally require a rape victim to marry her rapist, but doing so in that patriarchal society ensured the future economic security of the victim. So, really, forcing the rape victim to marry her rapist was for her own good. How you can make that argument and then seriously claim that the Bible shows that God doesn't condone rape is beyond my understanding. First, notice that a woman who isn't betrothed being raped is not a death penalty offense. If you rape another man's fiancée, you get put to death. If you rape a single girl, you pay a fine to her father. Because remember, women are worthless apart from their relationships with men, and also you have to marry her. So you pay the fine to her father because you've taken her virginity now. She's not worth as much. She's damaged goods. And then as further punishment, you have to marry her. Punishment to you, the rapist. You have to marry her. Also note the implicit assumption that marital rape does not exist. Well, next, Crain covers Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, which is a passage that lays out how a soldier can take home a beautiful woman captured as a prisoner of war, force her to shave her head, imprison her in his house for a month so she can mourn for her father and mother, who she'll never see again, presumably. And then, when the month is up, it says, you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you decide later that you don't want her, don't sell her or make her a slave. Just let her go. Crain says, quote, admittedly, in our culture today, we don't like the idea of anyone being obligated to marry. However, in the aftermath of ancient war, this was the best possible scenario for a woman. Her life was spared. And instead of facing a future with no economic means in a foreign land, she had the opportunity to fully integrate into Israelite society through marriage. Look at the words. Look at the vocabulary that Natasha Crain chooses to describe this barbaric arrangement. She was spared. Her life was spared. She had the opportunity to fully integrate into society. It was the best possible scenario. Hey, sure, it sounds harsh, but she could have gotten a lot worse. Rape apology. That's what that is. After a month of mourning, the man who captured and imprisoned her and forcibly shaved her head can go to her and be her husband, and she will be his wife. No mention of her having the option to say no. She's a prisoner, a legally taken prisoner. According to God's law, she's a legally taken prisoner. She has no choice. She has no way out of her own free will. He will be her husband, and she will be his wife. That's an act of rape that's being described there in the Bible. That's an act of rape that is being condoned, that is being regulated by God's law. That's an arrangement in which any kind of sex other than rape is virtually impossible. Well, what about the Midianites? Didn't Moses specify that the Midianites should be killed except for the virgin girls who the Israelites were to keep alive for themselves? Well, yes. But remember Deuteronomy 21:10 through 14, which we just went over. The captured Midianite girls would have been treated according to those laws. So everybody just calm down. The laws that condemn them to a lifetime of imprisonment and marital rape at the hands of men who participated in the slaughter of their families. So, that's the message there. We really shouldn't make such a big deal about what happened to the Midianite women in that passage, because, hey, remember, that's the best case scenario. That's the best possible outcome for them. They have an opportunity now to integrate into the society of the people who destroyed their society and murdered all of their people because God told them to. It's an opportunity. Crain summarizes a story from the book of Judges, where 400 virgin girls from the town of Jabesh Gilead are captured and turned over to the men of the Benjaminite tribe. She stresses that this story isn't presented as something God commanded. This is an example of an event which the Bible depicts, but does not approve of. The old, oh, that's descriptive, not prescriptive argument. And in conclusion, Crain declares that it's unfair to say that the Bible approves of rape when you interpret the Bible correctly, keeping in mind the cultural context in which the events depicted took place. You can see that neither God nor the Bible condones rape. No, what you see is that the patriarchal attitudes depicted, with women being treated as property with no will or rights of their own and no value apart from that assigned to them by men, which was rooted for the most part in their virginity and their ability to reproduce, were par for the course for that time. That's what that gets you. The problem isn't that the sexual mores of the cultures depicted in the Old Testament are different from our own. The problem isn't that the people of the Bible don't measure up according to our modern standards. The problem is the Bible depicts God presiding over a system that subjugated women, treated them as property, didn't allow them to give or withdraw consent, and condemned all women, or virtually all women, to lives of sexual slavery and servitude to their husbands, where they were basically housekeepers / broodmares. God never once issues any commands aimed at changing this system. God never once gives any indication that he's anything other than completely fine with this state of affairs. Just as with slavery, God is not merely indifferent to the rape and general subjugation of women in the Old Testament. He participates in it. He regulates it. He declares laws that establish that the life of a virgin is worth more than the life of a non-virgin, that the life of a woman who is betrothed is worth more than the life of a woman who isn't betrothed, that in all specified cases, the injured party, legally speaking, is not the woman who was assaulted, but the man to whom she belonged, her father, or her fiancé, or her husband. You can't acknowledge that God made these rules and tolerated a culture that treats women this way and then turn around and say, oh, but he doesn't condone rape. Yes, he does. That's exactly what he does. Over and over again, throughout the Old Testament, he condones rape. And so, apparently, does Natasha Crain. That is not her intention, I trust. But that's what she's doing, nonetheless. Moving on to chapter 32. Does the Bible support human sacrifice? Here's how Crain begins this chapter. Quote, in this final stop on our tour of moral outrage against the Bible, we'll look at the question of whether or not the Bible supports human sacrifice. She's just spent the last 2 chapters of her book defending the condoning of slavery and rape in the Bible. And look how flippantly she dismisses any and all concerns. It's just a tour of moral outrage that she's obliged to lead her readers on, because those skeptics are just so darn unfair to God and his holy eternal word. We skeptics we just won't shut up. We won't stop complaining about all the rape and slavery in the Bible. So I guess the Christians have to just, explain to their kids why this isn't actually such a big deal. It's the fault of the critics, really, for objecting to the rape and slavery in the Bible. Anyway, the Old Testament depicts the people who worship false gods practicing human sacrifice. But again, descriptive, not prescriptive. God condemns the practice of human sacrifice and forbids his chosen people from doing it. Though Crain does acknowledge that there are numerous, what she calls controversial passages in the Bible, where despite that prohibition, God does seem to command, or at least condone, human sacrifice. There are, she writes, too many questionable passages to cover them all, so she'll just go over some of the more commonly cited ones. She starts with the big one, which is God commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his son. And this doesn't count as a human sacrifice, she says, because Isaac wasn't actually sacrificed. And it turns out God's intention was never to sacrifice the child in the first place. It was to test Abraham's faith. So this story might not count as God condoning human sacrifice technically, but it is extremely troubling in other ways. First, it makes plain exactly what kind of faith God expects. Blind, unreasoning faith. I know that Natasha, Crain, and many other Christian apologists have argued otherwise. They've said, no, God wants you to have a well-supported, reasonable faith. That's not what he wanted from Abraham. He wanted someone who would blindly follow orders. If God tells you to do something, you should be willing to do it, even if it violates God's own rules, even if it requires you to murder your own child. You don't ask questions, you follow orders. That's what God wants in a faithful servant, at least according to the story of Abraham and Isaac. Second, even though God never intends for Abraham to go through with it, he still demonstrates just immeasurable cruelty by ordering Abraham to do it in the first place. And why does God force Abraham to nearly murder his own son? To test his faith. But God is all-knowing. Doesn't he know whether or not Abraham is truly faithful already? Shouldn't God at least be able to predict exactly what Abraham would do in any given situation with perfect accuracy? Why does God need to order Abraham to kill Isaac? Can't he just conduct a thought experiment? Wouldn't the conclusion he reaches as a result of that thought experiment be accurate, since he's God and he's perfect and he possesses all knowledge? Crain then notes several episodes from the Old Testament where people conducted human sacrifices, but she argues that God does not condone any of these actions. These are merely depictions, not condonings. And she turns to the story of Jephthah, who in the book of Judges vows to make a burnt sacrifice of his own daughter if God will grant him a victory in battle against the Ammonites. Jephthah wins the battle, and after graciously allowing his daughter to spend a few months with her friends before murdering her, Jephthah fulfills his vow. And Crain argues that this, too, is simply a descriptive passage with no indication that God condones the actions of Jephthah. She also suggests that it's possible Jephthah didn't intend to sacrifice his daughter at all, that he was actually offering his daughter as a living sacrifice by pledging her to remain a virgin and serve God all his life. Well, first of all, the suggestion that Jephthah didn't mean that he would kill his daughter is completely unsupported by the text. In Judges 11, verse 31, Jephthah promises to make a burnt offering of the first thing that emerges from his house when he returns home, if God allows him to win the battle. After the battle is won, he returns home, and his daughter is first out of the house to greet him. And Jephthah is upset by this. He says, "Alas, my daughter, I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot take it back." In other words, God is now expecting me to make a burnt sacrifice of you. It's clear that he's not intending to pledge her to remain a virgin in service to the Lord, which is problematic in and of itself. The notion that, oh, don't worry, he wasn't going to make a burnt sacrifice of her. He just took it upon himself as her father to pledge her virginity and her life in service to the Lord. Takes us right back to the patriarchal system that, again, apparently it's okay that God was completely on board with that and set that up. It's clear that Jephthah intends to sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering, not as some kind of living sacrifice. And sacrifice her as a burnt offering is exactly what he does, according to the text. Well, Crain argues that even if this is an example of human sacrifice, the text never suggests that God approves of it. But I beg to differ. The text never explicitly says that God approved of it. But Jephthah swore to make a burnt offering if God allowed him to win the battle with the Ammonites. He won the battle. He made the burnt offering of his own daughter. And in the following chapter, Jephthah characterizes his victory as having been the result of the Lord's deliverance. And the text never contradicts this or suggests that it was otherwise. And it also mentions that from that day, the Israelites have honored the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter. It's looked upon as an honorable thing. The impression left by that story is that Jephthah promised God a sacrifice. God answered his prayer, and Jephthah made the sacrifice, which was his daughter. If that's not God condoning human sacrifice, I don't know what it is. Let's go on to chapter 33. Why do Christians have varying views on how and when God created the world? And at this point, with this chapter, we enter the final part of the book, which is focused on conversations about science. So a very sudden subject change from the immorality of the Bible to science relating to the Bible. So, it's not just Christians and non-Christians who disagree over questions of the origin of the earth. Scientists disagree, or Christians disagree with each other about these questions. The two Christian views that are the most familiar to people are the two major forms of creationism, which would be young earth creationism, that proposes that earth was created over the course of 6 literal 24-hour days around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, and old earth creationism, which interprets Genesis less literally and accepts most of the scientific evidence that earth is actually billions of years old, not several thousand years old. Some Christians also hold a third view, which is called theistic evolution, which is a way of incorporating evolution into Christian views, and it proposes that evolution was God's method of creating humans, rather than a special creation in the Garden of Eden. God created us through evolution. And that's yet another attempt to reconcile Scripture with the facts of modern science. There's also intelligent design, which many Christians believe, and which, she doesn't mention this, but was in fact invented as a way of passing off creationism as something more acceptable. But it is not, and again, this is by design, it is not necessarily a Christian viewpoint. It basically is. It was invented by Christians. It's intended as a more acceptable form of Christian creationism, but technically speaking, because it was designed to be non-denominational and non-specific in terms of what creator it requires, the creator, that the intelligent designer named in Intelligent Design, does not necessarily have to have been the God of Christianity. It could have been any kind of powerful creative intelligence. Well, why should anyone care? Because, Crain reminds the reader, even if you aren't interested in questions of origin or whether this or that scientific theory is compatible with Christianity, it's important for your kids to have a solid understanding of these issues. Because remember, this is a parenting book. Science is often the dividing line between faith and atheism, Crain says, so you need to prepare your children so they'll know how to respond when they are told that Christianity and science are irreconcilable. And that's it for that chapter, a brief chapter, just to sort of set the table for the next few chapters to come. So let's move on now to chapter 34. What is young earth creationism? Well, young earth creationism is the explanation of the origin of earth that most Christians are the most familiar with, Crain writes, and that's because it's the one that is based on the most literal reading of Genesis. Not all Christians agree that the most literal reading is the correct one, especially in light of the fact that modern science has established that the age of earth contradicts the literal reading of the Genesis account. Earth, in fact, took much longer than 6 24-hour days to form, and it formed billions of years ago, not thousands of years ago. Crain discusses 4 key points of the biblical case for young earth creationism. First, there is the fact that Genesis, again with a literal reading, plainly states that earth was created in 6 literal days. though the Hebrew word translated as day in Genesis can refer to things other than a literal 24-hour day, it appears over 1,700 times in the Old Testament and does clearly refer to a 24-hour day most of those times. Genesis also references periods of daylight and darkness, which also suggests the passage of time during a normal day, not a longer period of time that is being metaphorically referred to as a day. When creation is referenced in other parts of the Bible, it is referred to as having taken place across what sounds like 6 24-hour days. That's number one. Second, the age of Earth can be estimated using genealogies found in the Bible, and using this method, an age of between 6,000 and 10,000 years is most likely. 3, the flood of Noah was an actual historical event and is responsible for creating many of Earth's geological features. This means Earth need not have existed for billions of years in order to give natural geological forces time to work and shape the planet into what we see today. And fourth, the Gospels are incompatible with an old Earth explanation. In the Gospels, Jesus comes to save humanity from the consequences of the original sin of Adam. One of the results of that original sin, according to this literal reading of Genesis, was the entrance of death into the world. But if death existed prior to Adam, as it must have according to old Earth models, which accept that life and death existed long before the appearance of the first humans, then death is not the result of Adam's sin, and therefore the world is not in a fallen condition due to original sin, and therefore the entire basis for Jesus' coming and his salvation is completely contradicted and refuted. Well, Crain doesn't really present arguments for or against this biblical case for young Earth creationism. She just sort of lays out the claims based on this literal reading of Genesis, and that's it. And it's just as well, because the argument for this point of view reduces to because the Bible says so, and the argument against it reduces to because reality, as we understand it through science, says otherwise. It's a fairly clean-cut case. It simply isn't true, to the best of our knowledge, to the best of our ability to answer the question. It simply isn't true that Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. It simply isn't true that death did not occur prior to the appearance of the first humans. It simply isn't true that there was a global flood, and that such a flood is a viable explanation for the geological characteristics of Earth. There is no scientific evidence for any of these claims, and quite a bit of scientific evidence to substantiate contradictory claims. And speaking of that evidence, let's go right on to chapter 35, which is, how do mainstream scientists estimate the age of the Earth? Well, Crain says that all scientific methods used to date the age of Earth result in an age of at least 10,000 years. So she acknowledges a problem, scientifically speaking, with young Earth creationism right there. No matter what method you use, the Earth has to be at least 10,000 years old. And actually, it has to be a great deal older than that, at minimum. She mentions 10,000 years because that is as old as most young Earth creationists are comfortable estimating Earth to be. And most of them like it to be a lot closer to that 6,000 than that 10,000. Well, Crain runs through 6 methods that are used by scientists to date the age of Earth. The first is tree rings. Since trees carry a record of their annual growth in the form of rings that can be viewed when they are cut down or when they have samples extracted from their trunks, estimating the age of old trees is actually relatively straightforward, and scientists can show that Earth must be at least 10,000 to 11,000 years old based on tree rings alone, because it has to have been around long enough for these rings and these massive ancient trees to have formed. Young Earth creationists argue that sometimes trees will grow more than one ring per year, which could lead to an inaccurate estimate if one assumes only a single ring grows per year. Plus, they point to the fact that the oldest living trees are around 4,500 years old, and they say that this is evidence that the flood of Noah took place around that time, and that's when all of the trees that were alive prior to the flood were killed. And then the oldest trees alive today are, of course, ones that came about after the floodwaters had receded. Young Earth creationists also argue that God may have created trees already mature when he made the world, just as he created Adam and Eve as mature adults rather than children. And if that was the case, then the tree ring data for trees that appear very old might not be accurate. If God created the first trees to be mature, would they still have tree rings? Just as though they'd grown up naturally? Isn't that a little bit like asking if Adam and Eve had belly buttons because they were created rather than born? I guess it's sort of the same thing. Next method of dating, ice core dating. Polar ice accumulates in discernible layers in a way similar to tree rings. Using deep ice core samples, scientists can conclude that Earth is at least several 100,000 years old. Because again, Earth would have to have been here long enough for all these layers of polar ice to build up. And if there's 100,000 or so years of ice that you're looking at in your core sample, makes logical sense. Earth has to have been here at least that long. Young Earth creationists propose that there was a relatively brief 700-year ice age that began shortly after the flood of Noah ended. And this ice age accounts for the highly compressed bottom layers of the polar ice, while normal annual layer growth has occurred for the few thousand years since the flood. Well, the next method of dating is varve dating, and this is one that's not as well known as these others. Varves are layers of sediment that collect at the bottom of lakes, and they also form layers, and they can also be used to determine date estimates in the same way. You have to have had an Earth present, existing, at least long enough for the varves to form in the ways that you observe. And according to varve dating, Earth has to be at least a few million years old, because that is the data that we get when we look at the deepest, oldest varve deposits. Young Earth creationists explain that, once again, it could be due to Noah's flood. Noah's flood is like the magic flood. It's what explains all of the things that are due to geology, that are due to billions of years of time passing and natural forces working on the surface of Earth. It's all because of Noah's flood. Noah's flood was a magic flood. It did whatever it did. Carving the Grand Canyon? Noah's flood. That was it. All these layers of sediment, all these fossils that are in clearly discernible layers, Noah's flood. Noah's flood did it all. And next is the most important method that is used to specifically date the age of Earth, and that is, of course, radiometric dating. If we know what element an unstable isotope decays into, and we know the rate of decay, we can estimate the age of a given sample by measuring the amounts of the given elements present. Using radiometric dating, scientists have determined that Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. And samples of meteorites that have fallen to Earth from space, originating elsewhere in the solar system, also have dated to around this age, which has led scientists to conclude that not only Earth, but our solar system in general is probably in the neighborhood of 4.5 billion years old. Young Earth creationists explain the results of radiometric dating by, one, misunderstanding how scientists use the measurements of elements in samples to determine age. They say, well, you can't know for sure because if you're measuring how much uranium-238 decayed into lead, well, how do you know that lead wasn't there in the first place? They're smart. They figured it out. I don't have time to go into it here, and honestly, I'm not the best person to explain it anyway, but if you look up how radiometric dating works, they figured that out. The scientists who figured out how to use radioactive decay to date rock samples figured out a way around that problem, because believe me, that occurred to them too, creationists. So just maybe read what they actually do to compensate for that, or to make sure that they don't get a radically wrong estimate because they're counting naturally occurring lead that wasn't as a result of radioactive decay along with the decaying uranium-238. It's actually really interesting. And number two, they also question the assumption of a constant rate of isotope decay. Crain says, quote, Young Earth creationists say that assuming a constant radioactive decay rate ignores the possible impact of God's curse or Noah's flood. Young Earth models often suggest God may have triggered the flood by causing a drastic change in radioactive decay rates. Again, Noah's flood, the magic flood. Not only did it carve the Grand Canyon and deposit all those layers of fossils that look like they built up over millions and millions and millions of years, but it somehow made a difference in the rate of radioactive decay. And to even suggest that God's curse may have affected the rate of decay is to admit that you're not actually interested in talking about science in the first place. The next dating method that is mentioned is starlight. And this method can be used to establish not a minimum age just of Earth, but of the universe itself. Since we know it takes light 1 second to travel a distance of 186,000 miles, an estimate of how distant a star is also serves as an estimate of the amount of time that must have elapsed since the light we're perceiving here on Earth left that star. Since we can see light from galaxies that are billions and billions of light years away, the universe must be at least that old. Otherwise, the light would not have had time to reach us. Young Earth creationists argue that, well, maybe God created the light from distant stars already in transit, just as he created Adam and Eve as adult humans and placed mature trees on the new Earth. They also suggest that the rate at which time flows may not have always been constant, or that some form of time dilation may be at work, making it look like light took billions of years to reach us when in fact it only took thousands. And finally, there is the dating method provided by measuring the rate of expansion of the universe. By measuring how fast or slow the universe is expanding, scientists can estimate how long the universe must have been expanding to reach its current size. And using this method, scientists estimate that the universe is around 13.8 billion years old. Young Earth creationists say that God stretched out the heavens as described in the Bible, which would call into question whether or not the universe has always been expanding at a constant rate. And Crain ends the chapter by noting that many Christians see no reason to deny the scientific facts of the age of the universe. So their case will be examined in the next chapter. So that's the end of this chapter. And before we wrap up the video, I just have a few just a few parting thoughts on this whole young Earth creationism exercise. Because see, the problem with young Earth creationism is that it gets the scientific method backwards. Young Earth creationists are not bad at thinking up inventive excuses for why the universe looks billions of years old, but is actually only several thousand years old. Some of these excuses are ingenious in their own way. Who else would think to suggest that God stretched the universe, or created starlight in transit, or altered the rate of radioactive decay during the Great Flood? Those are kind of brilliant excuses, but that's all they are, excuses. Young Earth creationists start with their conclusion, a conclusion which they reached through non-scientific means, and then mangle and distort and cherry-pick the evidence until it appears to point toward that preferred conclusion. If you start with the data from, for instance, radiometric dating, or starlight dating, or dating derived from the expansion of the universe, and you reason forward from that to the most likely conclusion, you'll never wind up concluding that the universe is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. There's just absolutely nothing in nature to suggest that. The only thing that suggests that Earth is that young is young Earth creationism, which bases its conclusions not on scientific investigation, but on a shallow, literal interpretation of a completely non-scientific religious text. And that's not science. And many Christians would agree with that, as we'll hear all about in the next and final video of this series. So I will join you in the next and final video of this series as we wrap up our considerations of keeping your kids on God's side by looking at the final 5 chapters, those being chapter 36, what is old Earth creationism? Chapter 37, what is evolution? Chapter 38, what are the major pieces of evidence for evolution? Chapter 39, what are the major challenges to evolution? And chapter 40, what is intelligent design? We'll cover those 5 chapters. We will wrap up this book and indeed wrap up the An Atheist Reads series in general for this year. That will be in the next video in this series. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this one so far. I hope you've gotten something out of it. I hope you got something out of this video. Please do feel free to leave a comment on this one, responding to something I've had to say here. If you think I got something right or got something wrong or left something out or went off on a rabbit trail that I shouldn't have, or I made a real good point, or I did a really terrible job at making a point, or whatever you have to say in response to what I have had to say, I'll be curious to read it. So, pardon me. So please do leave a comment on this video. And if you enjoy this work that I do, if you get something out of these Atheist Reads videos or my YouTube work in general, also, please do consider helping to support this channel, helping me to make more videos like this one by becoming a patron through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives and help me out for as little as $1 a month. And those pledges, whether they're $1 a month or $5 a month or $10 a month or however much you feel that I'm worth pledging, they genuinely make this possible. They make it possible for me to do this and to devote the time and the work into these videos that I feel like they need, and I could not do it without your support. So those of you who are supporting me through Patreon, thank you very much. Those of you who can afford it, who appreciate my work, please consider it, because it really does help me continue to do what I do. And if you pledge at a level of $5 a month or more, you can take advantage of some extra little perks. Like, for instance, I post the scripts for these videos a day before the video goes up, so you can get a sneak peek at the upcoming Atheist Reads video by reading the script if you are a $5 or more per month patron. So it's just a little bonus that I throw out there for folks who can afford to go a little bit above and beyond. So that's it. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you next time to wrap up our considerations of this book. Take care.